as if I didn't even play an intro, people, because you know what? I'd forgotten earlier on that I deleted the intros from the Backstage of Caribbean Cricket podcast. As unprofessional as ever, to the very core, Caribbean Cricket podcast will never ever do things as they're supposed to do them. So without any further ado, people, here's the intro to the actual show. Oh, there we go. I can't even play it because I'm so stupid I don't even know what I'm doing. Let's try again. Here's the intro, people.
West Indies Cricket, Caribbean Cricket Podcast. West Indies Cricket, Caribbean Cricket Podcast.
I love how unprofessional we are. Listen, I'm Machel St. Patrick Hewitt, one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, and welcome to the, as ever, Caribbean Cricket Podcast History Specials. Every time we drop a history special, people say to me, Mash, you need to do these more regularly. And I always promise and say, yeah, we're going to do them. So let's count them back so far. What have we done? We've done a history episode on colonialism, post-colonialism, the breakaway from the British Empire and what that means for the Caribbean. We've done it with an eye on what it means to West Indies cricket and the failure of the West Indies Federation. Our last Caribbean history special was on Dr. Walter Rodney. And I've been promising for ages that we would do a history special on Maurice Bishop. And I reached out to my pops, Dr. Reverend Roderick Hewitt, Professor Roderick Hewitt, and I said, Pops, come back in. We got to do Maurice Bishop. And my pop said, yeah. And then Pops, unfortunately, people cannot make it tonight. So he cannot make today's episode, but we've got a plan. I want to introduce to you the other guest on our show, who is part of the Caribbean Cricket Network, Suresh Rao. You've probably seen him in the intro videos for Caribbean Cricket Network, but he's making his long-awaited debut on Caribbean Cricket Network and Caribbean Cricket Podcast. And what we're going to do with this Maurice Bishop episode is we're going to break it down into two parts. So Pops is going to jump on, my Pops is going to jump on, but he's going to jump on part two. Suresh and I are going to set up part one and talk about part one of this Maurice Bishop special. And by the way, people, particularly those of you who might be watching this on the replay or live in the comments right now, do get in the comments and let me know whether during this episode or afterwards, who else should we be doing Caribbean cricket history specials on? I'm mindful that so far it's been very male-centric, so I'd love to do an episode on powerful women important, maybe is a better word, important women in Caribbean history. And so we should be doing an episode on that as well. So let me know who you'd like to see us cover, and I'll get all the necessary experts on. But without any further ado, let me bring on my guest for his long-awaited debut on the Caribbean Cricket Network, Caribbean Cricket Podcast, a Grenadian economist, Mr. Suresh Rao. Suresh, how you doing?
Not bad, Max. Thank you for having me, man. It's good to be here finally after such a long time. I've been missing in action for a bit, but better late than never.
Most definitely. Listen, people, Suresh has been on the injury list for quite a while, so it's good to see him back in the flesh. He's been battling some injuries, but he's on the mend, and it's great to have him live and direct on the show. Now, Suresh, first things first, let's do a bit of education for the watching public, both live and those who are watching this on the replay. Tell people where you're from, Suresh, because obviously when you first told me, my response was where? So first things first, let's do some Caribbean geography. First things first.
So Caribbean geography, I'm a Grenadian. Grenada is a tri-island state, so it's made up of the main island, Grenada, and two island dependency of the sister isles. So one is Carriacou, which is a small, 13 square mile island, and then the other one is Petit Martinique, which is even smaller still. So I'm from Carriacou, but there's some pretty big hitters from Carriacou anyway. We're small, but we're big in impact. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's one of those very quiet places that you don't really hear much about. You'd hear about Grenada, but not necessarily the sister isles. But I hope to change that.
Yeah, well, you're definitely going to do so today. So people, when Suresh told me, when I first met Suresh, wait, where did I meet you, Suresh? He was in Ireland, wasn't it?
Yeah, we met in Dublin, yeah.
So the first, I met Suresh people in Dublin when I went to go watch the West Indies play on the tour out there last year, which is the beauty of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast Network, the link up that it provides when you go all over the world and you meet people, etc. So that's where Suresh and I first linked up. And when he first told me he was from Carriacou, my immediate response was, "What'd you say? Just say CARICOM. What'd you say?" so big up, big up,
big up, big up the Sister Isles, man.
So big up all the people from Carriacou, and big up all the people from Grenada, and big up everybody who's locking in for this episode for their dose of Caribbean cricket history. So let's get into it. Suresh. Maurice Bishop. Where should we start? Do you know where I want to start, Suresh? When we talk about famous people in Caribbean history, and let's talk modern Caribbean history, do you think Maurice Bishop gets his due, or do you think because he's from Grenada and Grenada's got a very small population in comparison to some of the other Caribbean nations, that his story can actually get lost in the context of the wider Caribbean? Where do you rank him in the kind of importance in wider Caribbean history?
It's a really good question, Mash. I don't think his story gets lost. I think, you know, the weight of the man, the size and the impact that he brought to Caribbean politics, and not just modern Caribbean politics across different eras, because he was really a paradigm shifting, era defining politician. But he was known for a number of things. He was known, for example, for being one of the best orators the Caribbean has ever produced. His command of the language and his command of presence and timing and space and the pregnant pause was just, you know, never before seen in Caribbean political circles, really. So he was known for that, but he was also known for the sort of the different take he brought to political organization in the Caribbean at a time when the Caribbean was kind of just asserting itself on the global stage in a number of different ways. So I think his story has gotten a lot of kind of play over the years, but I think that is dying a little bit now with generational change, because we're moving further and further away from that era and into an era where you have more settled politics, less instability. You have sort of less repressive, a lower sort of incidence of repression around the Caribbean and around the sort of global South generally. But in his day, Maurice Bishop was a legend, and he was a towering figure in the sense that he was not only known in the Caribbean, he was known across the USA, he was known across the sort of social democracies of Northern Europe and the African continent, where you had sort of solidarity with the shared struggles they were having over there. So he was very well known. And I think his loss came at a really critical time for that kind of struggle, but we'll probably get into that at a later point in the podcast.
Let me pivot to a famous speech he did at Hunter College in the United States, right? And I picked this line on purpose. Bishop said that he saw Grenada as part of a Caribbean context. Quote, "We are one people from one Caribbean," he told Hunter College, "with one struggle and one destiny." In reference to America's Monroe Doctrine and its claim to a right to intervene in the region, he was unequivocal. "They like to talk a lot about backyard and front yard and lake. Well, Grenada ain't nobody's backyard and ain't part of nobody's lake." Now, I say that quote, Suresh, because I think that's as relevant today as it was when he made that speech to Hunter College. And this is why I wanted to do this focus. I've been delaying this kind of episode on Maurice Bishop. And actually, I just wonder if there is a message in some of Bishop's rhetoric that some in the Caribbean would do well to learn from and go back and study.
I would say 100% yes. So you take that Hunter College address, that was what, June 1983, right? And you can make very, very small tweaks to it and it'll be perfectly applicable to today. The sort of critique of the way the global North saw the global South, the imbalance of power in trading terms, in economic impact on power terms, and in economic influence terms. I think all of that is still very much relevant. You know, not much has changed for us. The shape of our democracies have changed. The shape of the way we interact with other democracies and with other states have changed, but not so fundamentally that core message is lost. And in much of Bishop's speeches, you would see the same kind of common thread. So I think there is a lot that is still relevant in that message from 1983, which is telling in a number of ways, but still inescapable.
So let's assume that people who go on to watch this episode aren't actually too familiar with Maurice Bishop for whatever reason. And let's assume that people watching this episode who aren't familiar decide, let me go pick up 1-2 books about this guy and try to understand who he was and his importance, etc. Where is the right place to start to understand? And I don't want you to jump to why or what he did in Grenada, but where's the right place? If you were going to guide someone and say, right, this is where you need to begin to understand the Maurice Bishop story, where do you go?
I'd say the beginning. So let me explain what I mean by that. Because even growing up in Grenada, for me to find out about Maurice Bishop as a young man growing up, trying to form my own kind of identity, trying to figure out where I fit in the political scheme of things, that is as much a journey of exploration than anything else. For a number of reasons. One, we're a small place where we don't do very well with recording, even though in this case there are very rich records about what happened and so on. But in kind of understanding who Maurice Bishop was as a person, I kind of had to take myself back to the start. There are a number of books written about the revolution, a number of books written about Maurice Bishop and how he became who he became, but nothing that really sort of unpicks his core political ideology. So maybe a good place to start. Let me give you a sort of informal kind of potted history of Maurice Bishop before he became the revolutionary. Would that work?
Yeah.
So just to unpick that, and this is a generational thing again. So Maurice Bishop is 1944 born, right? He wasn't actually born in Grenada. He was born in Aruba, because his parents moved to Aruba. His dad used to work in the oil fields there, Rupert Bishop. So his parents moved to Aruba, and he was born in 1944 and only moved back to Grenada in 1950. Went to school in Grenada, where he was outperforming really. And in 1963, he moved to London to study law at the University of London. And that is where his activism actually begins, in London. So he was part of the West Indian Student Union, which has come from a particular political leaning. He set up sort of legal aid clinics in Notting Hill for West Indian people here. He was part of the campaign against race discrimination. So you can see the young activist kind of coming up. But much like Manley from Jamaica, he sort of started discovering his anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-war, socialist sensibilities in the UK. So it's very much an absorption of the sort of the UK socialist sensibilities of the time, the 60s, the mid 60s, studying here. He goes back to Grenada in 1969 and immediately gets involved in social causes, and he sets up a social organization called MAP, Movement for Assemblies of the People, which tells you a lot about who he is. He's instantly interested in sort of moving the country forward and identifying where the issues are and helping to break that down. So clearly he's left Grenada, started sort of finding his shape. He now moves back and is kind of asserting that, finding his place in Grenada and finding a way to put that into use. But as much as his story is important, it's also important to consider the wider political context of Grenada at the time, which was a really incredibly, sometimes surprisingly politically unstable place for such a small island. So
Suresh, let me jump in there because, and by the way, people, I said Suresh, I'll jump in at random times when he's talking.
Anytime.
And you're possibly about to go into it, but as you were talking about, okay, he forms MAP. Weave for me though, because Grenada's late to get independence. So do you see his political leanings and activity in the context of Grenada doesn't break away from colonial Britain until the 70s? So do you see it as tied to that, or do you see it as tied to dissatisfactions in general about Grenadian society and how it's running?
I think it's the latter. I think it's the latter, and the latter takes on two dimensions. So the first one is, yes, we were still under British rule, so we were subject to a premier. So Sir Eric Matthew Gary was a premier from 1967 up until independence in 74, and there was deepening dissatisfaction with the leadership of the country at the time, all the way in the run up to independence. So in a way, it was less so the sort of umbrella influence of the British and more so what was happening on the ground in Grenada, dissatisfaction of what was happening on the ground in Grenada, and the ability and capacity for Grenadian people, for the working class in Grenada, to participate in the running of their country, in the conduct of their government. It was sort of a very, in the lead up to independence, especially under Gary rule, it was a very isolating kind of place for people who are either on the margins of society or who didn't have the sort of weight to sort of get directly involved in the leadership of the country. And Gary himself is a really fascinating character, by the way. Gets a bad rap, but is a very complicated character that is probably worth getting into. But the point is that, you know, Maurice Bishop and people who were similar in mind started agitating against Gary in the lead up to independence because of the way people were being treated by Gary and by the Garyite regime.
How important, and I guess you'll have to set the now actually there's some, in fact, let me throw this in. So Rod says, because, and by the way, people, those obviously in the live right now, do throw in questions as you go along. So follow on says Maurice Bishop, the most influential Grenadian they may ever be, and we'll get into that, possibly more so in part 2 than part 1. Kelly says great content, Grenadian in the house. So big up the Grenadians who are in the house. Share this with your aunties, your uncles, Petit Martinique and Carrick. Wait, what do you describe a Carriacou? Well,
a Carriacouan.
Carriacouans.
You could just say a kayak. Just say a kayak. You know?
So, but Rod says here, Bishop was heavily influenced by the Black Power movement and the socialist philosophies of Julius Nyerere, Tanzanian politician. And actually, when I did the Rodney episode, my dad mentioned Julius Nyerere as well in relation to Walter Rodney. Do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So in and maybe this is a bit that I glossed over when I said about him developing his kind of socialist leanings in the UK while he was here. You know, the reports about how he sort of formed those views suggest that he was very heavily influenced by people like C.L.R. James, the movement that Che Guevara was part of, people like Kwame Nkrumah, you know, that sort of generation. And yes, you absorb from across states where this is the emerging philosophy. You absorb that. The Black Power. I think there were some Black Power uprisings in Trinidad in the late 60s, early 70s. He was very heavily influenced by that as well. And the New Jewel movement, the party that became the New Jewel movement, was a merger between MAP and Jewel, and they exist almost at the intersection of the Black Power movement, the sort of social struggle, and Marxist-Leninist ideology. They're not just one thing. And that is a really important point to bring out as well. It's sort of where his socialist tendencies have come from. And some of that, maybe he was so into that direction, so far leaning into that direction that it ultimately became part of his downfall, which we'll probably look at another time. But yeah, that's an absolutely correct kind of suggestion there.
So the New Jewel movement, I looked up what Jewel actually stood for, because I've only heard it as Jewel movement. I wrote it down somewhere. Where is it?
It's a joint endeavor
for welfare, education,
yes,
and liberation.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, right? Obviously, I'm a history teacher, a politics teacher. To me, I think I'm probably formulating this idea in my head as I'm talking to you right now. A lot of things are formed in the time that they exist in, right? So if Bishop was alive, if Maurice Bishop was alive today, do you think he could form an organization like Jewel and have the political cut through? Obviously, this is all hypotheticals, and have the political cut through, or do you see things like that as, yeah, but that's the 1970s, that's the early 1980s, it's Cold War politics, it's the rise of left-leaning socialist, democratic socialist, call it what you want, Marxist, Leninist, call it what you want, because Manley was doing the same thing to an extent in Jamaica. So do you see it as he's just a product of the time, or do you see it as he could be alive today and be the same age today and would be able to start something like this and get traction?
This is a question I've asked myself for a number of times, because And I think it's really important about how we try to mesh different historical eras. And you're right. Fundamentally, I think it was context driven. You know, the Gary movement was increasingly authoritarian. Gary started off as a trade union leader and a hero of the poor, and he became increasingly authoritarian, but also increasingly unhinged. Like, this is a guy who went to the UN and said, you know, let's set up an agency for psychic research into UFOs, kind of thing. Like, he increasingly became seen as an embarrassment to Grenada, but at the time he started becoming even more violently oppressive, right? So he had, like, you know, like Papa Doc Duvalier had the Tonton Makut. He had the Mongoose Gang in Grenada, whose sole purpose was to exact state-sanctioned violence on political opponents. That meant a certain movement was necessary that moved away from the sort of neo-colonial or immediate post-colonial ideas about organizing a government into something new that would bring people who are all sharing a struggle above the line. And that is what that socialist, you know, like, if you notice, like, across the global south, across several states in Africa, across several parts of the Caribbean, Central and South America, you had the rise of socialism at the time, which is, again, like, you know, it's sort of like smaller countries with smaller state power asserting themselves on the global stage. So the time was definitely right. And I do wonder if, for example, he was alive today and decided to do the same thing, if, one, he would get the critical mass from the population, because the revolution was backed by an immense wave of popular support. You know, at one point there couldn't be a labor shortage in Grenada, according to reports, because people threw themselves into building roads, and, you know, it was a for us by us kind of thing, because they proposed and they sort of embodied a participatory democracy, which is what they called it. It's like a grassroots democracy, and I don't know if you would get the same kind of critical mass now, because society has a fundamentally different shape. But the global view of socialism is very different to what it was in the 70s and in the early 80s, because around the world, most people view socialism as a failed experiment, where, in fact, sort of experiments like ours in Grenada and experiments like Samora Machel's in Mozambique, they were basically unfinished. You know, Thomas Sankara's experiment was unfinished. So I think, you know, looking at it from a very objective point of view, it would be very hard for him to get that critical mass now, because of the perceptions around what the socialist ideal looks like. And so it probably was a thing for its time.
Bishop, a lot of his writings, and when I was doing my research on Maurice Bishop, spoke about people needing to accept that. I think there's something I read where it's like, for capitalism to become the dominant ideology took centuries upon centuries, right? So his argument was, for socialism to replace capitalism, it's going to take centuries upon centuries. So I don't think he was ever under the kind of notion of, right, I'm going to sweep socialism to power in Grenada, and that's just going to fix everything overnight. I think he very much had I'd almost argue that he might have even looked at himself as I'm just a cog in a much bigger wheel, so to speak, and almost like, I can see where this needs to go as a revolutionary principle. I want this for my nation, but this is almost like a socialist revolution throughout the world. Almost, you could argue that he's looking at it in that principle. But when you are, and again, it's hard, because a lot of what we talk about, Suresh, we're talking with a 21st century lens, looking back at something that has happened, right? But do you think, and I also, like say, and I'll reference Manly again in Jamaica, because I think Jamaica has its own kind of story that runs some kind of parallels with Bishop,
of course,
in terms of ideology. When you are on the doorstep of the United States, and in Bishop's case, openly form a relationship with Cuba, he must have known what was coming. He has to have known what was coming next. Or do you genuinely believe that he thought, I can lead a socialist revolutionary government in Grenada? Grenada's so small that no one's going to care about the fact it's happening.
It definitely wasn't the latter. And you know, there's a very interesting take on it. So while Bishop was saying, I'm a non-aligned guy, like, our country is non-aligned, we're not taking sides here, We have our revolution. That is our revolution. It's a homegrown thing, grassroots democracy. We are bringing a paradigm shift to it. And they really did bring Grenada into a new era. I mean, the achievements of the revolution in 4.5 years it existed, phenomenal. But it's almost as if he's pragmatic enough to realize what he's doing. So at the same time he's saying he's non-aligned, he's supporting Russia's incursion into Afghanistan, which is a really interesting thing to do when the US is saying, well, you're actually aligned to the Soviet Union, not Russia, the Soviet Union as it was then. And the thing is, if he did a speech in September 1982 called The Line of March, which is where he set out what he envisioned the reorganization of the party, the People's Revolutionary Government, and the party that governed it to look like. And in there is really telling exactly what you said at the start in terms of socialism taking time to bed in. His plan was for a gradual move to socialism. So what they proposed actually wasn't a state monopolistic kind of Marxist-Leninist approach, which is what the economic formulation was in every other Marxist-Leninist state. He didn't believe in state monopoly, and what he said was he believes the state should have dominance in some key areas like utilities, like international trade, like over financial institutions and so on, but that the rest of the market should operate like a free market, which I find really interesting as an economist, because it's a mixed economy, but in a completely different direction to the way I would think about it conventionally. So really what he is saying is, I understand that socialism is not going to come overnight. And I understand that there needs to be a certain degree of flex in the way you formulate and organize your economy in order for it to be sustainable. But ultimately, what we want to get to is a version of the world where people can participate, people can engage, and people can get the reward of participating and engaging. And I think that is really crucial. So it wasn't meant to be like a 1,000-year change or a 100-year change, but he saw it very much as a gradual process. And he wasn't, and there wasn't this, maybe in a way there was, well, it's a revolution, there would have been a degree of force applied. But in terms of the way the economy was organized, I think it could have been a lot more hardline than it was. And I think that showed a bit of vision. It showed that, there was a sort of practical reality at the back of the mind saying, you need to go slower or else you would break things. I mean, it didn't run for long enough for us to know whether or not that was the right thing to do or whether or not it would work. But equally, that there was that consideration is quite important as well.
Maurice Bishop was a black man. Let's go there. Let's take it there. Maurice Bishop was a black man to a certain extent, preaching, and that you can counter this if you don't agree. To an extent, he was a black man preaching black liberation. Right? You might say more than to an extent, but let me just try and caveat it with to an extent. How much of the opposition to him, not in Grenada, I'm talking elsewhere, was the fear of a powerful orator within the Caribbean sparking almost like a domino effect, domino theory across the rest of the Caribbean that, well, one of two things. Either one, he might have the influence of a domino effect of saying, we come together as one, and I don't know, spread a socialist ideology across the whole Caribbean in line with Manly in Jamaica and Cuba, and start to build a genuine West Indian Federation. There's that threat. Or even two, the threat that if he had a domino style effect across the Caribbean, again, I go back to the United States, the idea that African Americans in the United States might be like, hold on a minute, what's going on over in the Caribbean? This man talking certain things about freedom and liberation. Do you think that played a role or not?
It definitely did. I mean, and I think at the tail end of the revolution, when things really started to wane, so that Hunter College address, 1983, my understanding is that part of Maurice Bishop's mission in the US was to have a sit-down chat with Reagan to discuss normalizing relationships, and he was shunned. They sent him to speak to an ambassador instead, and he thought, you know what, if you don't have time for me, you don't have time for me, I'm a big man. So he goes to Hunter College, does this address, and in that address, he makes the point very, very clearly where he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, the US seemed to view the Grenada Revolution as the most dangerous of its kind for two reasons. The first one is that it's an English-speaking country, And the people of Grenada who are benefiting from the revolution can communicate directly with the people of the United States of America. So this seed planted. And for the second reason, 95% of the Grenadian population is Black. And therefore, that might serve to empower and embolden the 30 million Black people in the US who are fighting a similar struggle. And so I think the US were acutely aware of the potential impact a sort of key central figure in a movement of that kind could have. Someone whose a political ideology and someone whose character is informed by the Black Power movement, by the ages-long civil rights struggle, by the struggle of undereducated, underfunded, oppressed African states that are just finding their ways as nascent states as well, because they were all relatively new states. They were all kind of post-colonial states in the same way we were in the Caribbean. And so I think that was a very clear threat. It was a very clear threat. And because of that, you find the US sort of got more and more involved, or at least the suspicion was always there that they got more and more involved in trying to subtly destabilize the revolution without actually getting directly involved in doing so. So there are loads of issues. For example, in the same way the CIA got involved in the Manley government and tried to undermine it, there were similar questions about what was happening in Grenada. So in June 1980, for example, at a political rally in Queen's Park, a bomb went off in the middle of one of the stands. And the suspicion then was that it was intended to wipe out the leadership of the party. Killed 3 people, injured numerous others, but the leadership was still safe. So, you anger America and you end up in a situation where you're living on the edge. It automatically becomes a very sensitive situation. It automatically becomes a case where you need to watch your back because someone is looking at you. So, I think he was acutely aware of that.
Let's talk about the positives, and then I might want to talk to you about some negatives, or perceived negatives. The positives first. For Grenadians, again, or people of the Caribbean, or anybody who's watching this, is nothing even to do with the Caribbean. Maybe you just love history and politics, right? What type of tangible change did he bring to Grenada that you, with your Grenadian hat on, say, I wish we could have that again? So if you were going to say to someone, no, he actually did some positive things in this country, what would be the things that you would point to?
Can I do it with my economist hat on as well? I'll do it with both.
Whichever direction you want to go in.
All right. So for a bit of context, what was Grenada like at the point the revolution started, right? The People's Revolutionary Government. So, for example, according to People's Revolutionary Government statistics, 49% of the country were unemployed. We had a 49% unemployment rate. Among women, that rate spiked to 70%. Now, those figures are disputed because the official figures coming out of the Gary government immediately before that said it was more around 20% overall. But it's somewhere in between, because the Bishop government had every incentive to make it look as bad as possible, and the Gary government had every incentive to make it look as good as possible. So, disputed or not, somewhere in that range, let's say. By 1982, the 1982 census that was run in Grenada, that rate had fallen from 49% to 14%, which is wild when you think about it, because you're not talking about a considerable passage of time. You're talking about sort of 3.5 years, right? Grenadian GDP increased 5% year on year, if I remember the stat correctly, for the first 3 years of the revolution. The GDP per capita in 1979 was around $450, and in 1983, it was around $870. That is a drastic material change in the living standards for people. But even beyond that, so GDP doesn't capture welfare. It doesn't capture how good you feel to be part of a nation. It doesn't capture the spirit you have of the time, right? But a lot of that's captured in the rates of participation. So, for example, they had the National Women's Organization, which politically and economically engaged women who were previously left on the margins of economic and political involvement. So their labor participation rates went through the roof as well, relatively speaking. And we've had adult literacy rates improving massively over time because of the teaching programs they had, the number of scholarships. And those scholarships were sort of targeted in areas where you identified key development needs, so engineering and healthcare, which is why we had the whole Cuban medical program, that sort of thing. Where, engineers would go to the Soviet Union to study and come back, or to Cuba and come back. So there was a lot of that happened. You had quite a lot of infrastructure development as well. You know, my reading of it, and I've not seen it kind of described in this way, but my reading of it was that the revolution, being a sort of grassroots democratic movement, or something approximating to that, sought to, first of all, eradicate poverty, educate people into development, and diversify the industries in Grenada. Because prior to the revolution, the main industry was agriculture. And that is inherently risky, having a single sector economy, right? So essentially what they sought to do was build an airport to get some tourists in, you know, start thinking about manufacturing, start thinking about food processing, start, you know, at one point, my understanding is, I mean, I wasn't wrong, but my understanding is that they were selling jams and jellies made by the revolutionary government and the cooperatives within that revolutionary government for sale in the UK. So I think a lot materially happened. And and I think, and with the economist hat on, I think that is only possible because you have a certain degree of conviction and a certain strength of will that is unencumbered by outside processes. So you kind of have, and the way to look at it, Mash, is if you are a nascent democracy, you cannot possibly function in the same way with the same type of democracy that a 300-year-old democracy has, or that a 200-year-old democracy has, because your systems are not well established. The rule of law needs to be established. Your public institutions need to be made stable and secure. You need to have free information flows. So I think at the early stages of Grenadian state, the Grenadian state, maybe that was what was needed to sort of level up. You know, at the end of the revolution, Grenada had one of the most literate populations in the world. So I think, you know, there are benefits that you can measure tangibly from the revolution. But as you say, it's not without its downsides, because it is a revolution, and it is a potentially displacing, very difficult, damaging, and challenging thing for people who are on the other side. So, you know, it wasn't without its disbenefits, to put it that way. It's not like an overwhelmingly romantic story. It's the story of the real history of a country, right? So, you know, some of the downsides of it is political opposition was banned. So you basically heard one political voice, right? You had silencing.
Pause there. Pause. So I read an extensive quote from Maurice Bishop explaining why. So his argument was, in essence, was that one of the reasons why because obviously he didn't hold elections, right? And his argument around elections centered around the fact that, well, this is a revolution. We have to embed the revolution before you can have elections. And the problem with that argument is that I've seen and read of many dictator who make those kind of claims where they go, well, you know, it's a revolution and the revolution's for the country, and we got to embed the successes of the revolution first, and then we can go and have elections. I don't even know what question I'm asking you from that. But I guess I'm saying to you, that doesn't look good.
It doesn't. It doesn't. So aside from sort of banning political opposition, because of the morning of the revolution, the constitution was suspended, and it was viewed as a neo-colonial constitution that needed to be rewritten for us by us, because you know, throughout the Eastern Caribbean, for example, throughout the Caribbean in post-colonial time, the British left, and they left with a hastily drafted sort of a generic version of a constitution that people had to, you know, amend and ratify at some later point, right? And so the revolutionary government decided, look, we'll suspend this. We need to anyway to have the revolution, but we'll redo something, and we'll get some elections going somewhere along the line as soon as it's practical. Right, which is the thing. As soon as it's practical, whenever that is, how long is a piece of string? So that didn't happen. The constitution was the new constitution never saw the light of day to begin with. But on top of that, the other side of that is, if you run a revolution for longer than you think you need to, for longer than the people think you need to, you will have a counter revolution, and that is inescapable, because you give people enough time to mobilize and agitate, and then destabilize. So that was happening as well. And so you had a big problem with the revolution, was that you had a large number of political detainees, almost sort of collected over time, because if you were perceived to be counter-revolutionary, you were locked up. No trial, no sort of questioning, no charges, just take some chill time in prison. So that was another downside. Another downside is that we had a paramilitary force, which was made up of young people just walking around with guns everywhere and sort of intimidating people on the streets. Whether or not they were doing it on purpose or whether or not they had an intimidatory effect is another story. So there were these issues, and you know, like, the thing is, you expect in a revolution to have a certain degree of displacement, which is exactly what Maurice Bishop said as well. You know, and he put it in a very brutal way, I thought. I'm not sure if you've ever come across this, but he said things like the locking up of political detainees. You kind of expect that, and the alternative is a mock trial or a pretend trial or a firing squad. So the humane thing to do is to lock them up. And I thought there is an underlying current of brutality here that means people who are on the other side of the revolution must be scared out of their minds about what is happening and what might happen to them should they voice the opinions they need to have, but that they could otherwise voice in a completely free society. So this idea that you had a grassroots democracy runs almost counter to the idea that there was some aspects of the freedom you would expect in that kind of society not being available, or not being freedoms that you could readily express. So I think, you know, as with everything, you kind of have downsides, you kind of have issues, you kind of have, you know, there are always opportunities to challenge, and I think there are a fair few opportunities here. And again, as a revolutionary, Maurice Bishop would be a very complicated character. Not everyone would have everything fascinating to say about him, or interesting, or sort of like the romantic idea of the freedom fighter kind of thing. There are people whose lives would have been seriously disrupted by the revolution as well, and Grenadians, and so, you know, it's worth bearing that in mind too when we think about the legacy of Bishop and what the revolution represented.
I'm wary of where I go, because my dad is coming through for part 2, so I don't really want to spoil part 2, people. So if you didn't join the live at the beginning, my pop sends his apologies, people, but Professor Hewitt will be joining myself and Suresh for part 2 of this Maurice Bishop debate, to turn it into a bit of a round table. But what I'm going to ask you, Suresh, is this. So whilst you were talking earlier on, I had to, because I'm not too au fait with the timeline from Bishop's assassination to all the next leaders that Grenada ends up with. And obviously there's been a few been there for a while. Keith Mitchell been there for donkey's years before he was replaced, and so on and so forth. What I'm more intrigued about is, once Bishop's gone, when a country has such a strong political figure attached to it, and I'm trying to think of, I mean, every Caribbean nation really and truly has its own, right? So I'll give my Jamaican context. You can't be a Jamaican and not know about the Manleys. You just can't. And you can't be a Jamaican and not have the shadow of Siaga and what he meant to Jamaica hanging over your head, right? Certain political figures, and it's interesting that I mentioned those names because they attach to this same Cold War era that I'm talking about, right? In Jamaica, we know those names. You can't not know those names, right? What do you feel is Grenada's, or no, let me rephrase that question. How do you feel Grenada looks back on Bishop now? And when my dad comes in for part 2, we're going to take it to the wider Caribbean, because I think there's a different question about the wider Caribbean than from Grenada specifically. Do you think Grenada has come to terms with Bishop? Like, because I don't know Grenadian systems and schools, and was there a whitewashing of Bishop, like as a young youth coming up? Do you remember anybody talking really and truly about his impact on the country? So where does he stand now? Or do you think it's one of those ones where it's like everyone tried to forget, and then over time everyone's like, no, let's not forget that, actually there's some things to be learned?
I think it's a complicated picture. So for example, I, like, coming through primary school, coming through secondary school, learned actually very little about Maurice Bishop, except the bare bones about the revolution. And, you know, like, without getting into sort of the things the revolution did, like, none of that was sort of taught. None of that was, you know, and And I found it as an adult, as a young adult growing up, I wanted to explore that, and I did. But it's not through exposure at school. I don't think it's whitewashing. I think it was a gap. There was definitely a gap there. I think there was a period of darkness that followed the revolution. The October 19th thing. The revolution collapsed, and there was a period of extreme darkness because you had an execution on the one side. You had the instant imposition of martial law with a shoot-on-sight demand. Basically, there was a shoot-on-sight curfew put in place by the Revolutionary Military Council and the RMC, who took over running the country under the military general at the time. So it was a period of darkness that I think people took a long time to heal from. On both sides, the people who lost loved ones in the October 19th sort of massacre, if you want to call it that, they lost on two levels, because they lost the vision they had for a country that was in full flow, and they lost family and they lost friends and so on. But it also kind of showed that there can be an unknown, unspeakable darkness in people that you don't expect. Like, I wouldn't walk in St. George's and expect someone to line up someone on a fort somewhere and do that to them. So I think there was a bit of a reckoning happening. I think the identity of the Grenadian people was shaken. It had to have been, because Maurice Bishop was very widely loved, and even now, that the kind of the sense of feeling people have for him still exists. So I don't think he's as polarizing a character to the sort of broad population. I mean, there are pockets, and there are people who will obviously have views against, and that is just what you find in a society. But I think he is generally, especially in some parishes where he might have been more popular, still quite a popular figure. You often hear people kind of invoke the name of Maurice Bishop if they, like, you hear it more often than you would expect, really. So during the political season, if someone is on a platform and they speak really well, they'll be like, this person reminds me of Maurice, right? Just that is the way people are with it. And I don't think it's about people hiding. I think, in the recent time, for example, he has been recognized. So the airport is now named after him, Maurice Bishop International. There's a highway named after him, and people are slowly coming to terms with what happened. So we have National Heroes Day since 2023, which is October 19th. And it's not a day of celebration, but it's a day of recognition more than anything else, because there's that darkness is not something worth celebrating, but it's worth recognizing that it is possible, that the human character is fallible, and that we kind of have to reconcile with that and move on in a way. So I don't think it's a forgotten chapter in Grenadian history by any means. What I think I would have enjoyed or would have benefited from more as a 10-year-old coming up is getting a sort of insight into what that period was, because it was very formative. It shaped the kind of community I grew up in, because the community I grew up in still had that community spirit that was sort of inherited almost from the revolution. So, for example, the village I grew up in had a women's group, the Windward United's women's organization, which was a throwback to the revolution and the sort of community level organization you had there. But understanding where my community has come from, understanding why I've sort of absorbed the culture that I've absorbed from that community is a good place to start, especially when I'm kind of thinking about my identity as a Grenadian man, right? So it's not so much forgotten, but I don't know, probably not a clear enough part of the way we are educated as Grenadians about our own history, which is probably a problem across much of the Caribbean, really. Our history is only just starting to come into the front pages of the history we read. So,
Bernard, how do you pronounce his surname?
Cord.
Bernard Cord. when I read up on Bernard Cord, do you know what came into my head when I was reading up on him? So, for those listening to this who aren't of Grenadian extract, Bernard Cord is largely seen as the person who leads the coup. Let's call it a coup. Who leads the coup against Maurice Bishop, and ultimately leads to a firing squad, puts him under house arrest, firing squad, etc. It reminded me, when I was reading up on him, it reminded me of how Thomas Sankara was removed. The upright man. People, anyone listening to this, if you don't know about Thomas Sankara, everyone, after you've started reading about Maurice Bishop, you need to go read about Thomas Sankara as well. But yeah, Maurice Bishop's removal kind of had parallels to me for how Sankara gets removed internally. But I've always, and maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist, so I'm just intrigued to see, and this is the perfect point at which we probably draw a line on part one.
Yeah, I mean, that.
Yeah, just go riff. Let me see where you go with this. Talk to me.
So I think that is a complicated story, and as with everything else, you'll find the whole revolution was complicated. You know, the thing is the Revolutionary Party, the PRG, the People's Revolutionary Government, and the Central Committee that was running it. So let me go back one step. The organization of the governing structures for the revolution was very Marxist-Leninist. The economic model wasn't, but they had, for example, a central committee where the political decisions were made by a Politburo. So pretty standard, you know, textbook Marxist-Leninist stuff. And it got to the point where Grenada was going through a period in sort of the tail end of 1982, where there was a sign of a sort of oncoming conflict. Bernard Coad resigned from the central committee of the party. He was a deputy leader. He resigned in 1982. Shortly thereafter, you know, and this was a time when we had a global recession. Not many people remember that 1980 to 1982, we had a big recession. So Grenada wasn't doing well economically. The revolution was faltering a little bit. You couldn't get people to come out to volunteer for the revolution. You know, the community support started waning because the revolution wasn't doing that well. And Coad started positioning himself almost as a counter to Maurice Bishop, because Maurice Bishop, and this is part of it, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil the next episode. But what ultimately happened was there was a split in the party along ideology lines, where Coad maintained a sort of, and interestingly as well, a more Stalinist approach, where he was more ultra left leaning, and Maurice Bishop kind of adopted a more socialist, moderate sort of left leaning. So there was that ideology, but also at the same time, the party was becoming increasingly divorced from the public, because the public saw Maurice Bishop as the face of the revolution, the embodiment of the revolution. And in fact, it was the party that was embodying the revolution and determining the outcomes of the revolution. So there was that bit of disconnect. And really, you know, the option was put to Maurice Bishop to have joint leadership of the party. And whatever happened there, we'll cover in the next episode, at the start of the next episode, hopefully. But what they tried to do was, this is just my view, sideline him by saying, right, Maurice, you are the better communicator, so we want you to lead, but to co-lead with the better planner and organizer, who we believe is Bernard Coad. And so you had, in the words of Bob Marley, you had a proper internal power struggle. And that sort of was what it was. And Coad started positioning himself increasingly as opposed to the sort of quote-unquote softness that Maurice Bishop kind of presented, the fact that he wasn't a hardliner, the fact that he didn't want to go so hard in certain directions. And by that, because Bernard Coad was closer to the party than Maurice Bishop was, it was easier for him to control the party and the military, which in large part were one and the same. And Maurice Bishop didn't have the agency to do that himself, to kind of wrestle it back. So that is where that unwinding started. But the thing is, you kind of always find in these movements, you always find those similarities. And I agree with you, like you would always find someone who has a difference of opinion that triggers a chain of events that leads to the unwinding of the entire movement. And there is something to be said there about human nature, but you know, maybe for the next one.
People, do you know what? The reason I paused people is because I was like, nah, how's Suresh just going to leave it there? But actually, I think we have to leave it there, because what's super interesting in terms of everything that we've covered so far is that, and we've done it on purpose, in fairness, nowhere really have we gone in depth into the United States of America, because you really can't finish this story off without then linking to, so what was the United States doing? And of course, people, if you know your history, no sooner after Maurice Bishop is removed, which we'll touch on at the start of part 2, do you then see the United States military decide that they're going to pop over to Grenada as well. But as we'll probably do in part 2, but I want you to kind of leave people on a cliffhanger, Suresh. that didn't just happen on a whim. The United States don't just randomly come into your country. They don't just decide a day before, yeah, let's go Grenada. That had to have been years in the making, and then an opportunity presents itself. But don't give away the details of people, but give us a cliffhanger for part 2.
Let me give you a bit of a flavor of you know, the way I saw that bit unfolding, and I think the way history kind of records it unfolding. So the revolution was never viewed favorably by the US at all. You know, you think about the Monroe Doctrine and what the Monroe Doctrine means for how America thinks, well, the rights America thinks it has over the direction of travel of governance in anywhere near it in this region. When the revolutionary happened, it was never going to allow a socialist uprising to exist and blossom and flourish in, according to Maurice Bishop, its backyard, right? So there was always fierce opposition. When the revolution started, it was the Jimmy Carter government. And then when Reagan was elected in 1981, the hostility towards the revolution ramped up. Partly because the Reagan government, they were very, well, this is a right-leaning American government, so conservative tradition, with very clear views on capitalism and on the proliferation of capitalism across all of the areas surrounded by them. It's a Cold War context, and they were very anxious about Russia and the influence on Cuba and now Grenada, et cetera, et cetera. Nicaragua was happening as well. So America basically, they adopted a very hostile posture towards Grenada, but not fully outwardly. For example, there are suggestions that America had planned to intervene in Grenada since 1981, but they didn't do it because they thought Grenada would have massive support from the Cuban army. But that's a story for another time. But ultimately, what they thought was that Grenada could be sort of the front runner for a new socioeconomic order, and essentially Grenada was seen by America as the threat of a good example. That's the best way to put it. And that threat needed to be addressed. So basically, what you find is increasingly hostile posture. Grenada is being seen now as the threat of a good example. You don't want anyone to follow it, so we can't allow this thing to survive. Once you're on America's radar, they are going to come for you. And I think I could leave it there.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're just giving you 57 minutes, just short of an hour. I can't believe I kept Suresh to an hour.
Is it only an hour, Mash?
We're giving you just short of an hour for part 1. My pop said to me before, my pops rang me before we went live and said, Mash, move this to tomorrow so I can jump on. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and coordinate between myself, Suresh, and my pops joining us from Jamaica to kind of move to part 2. We'll try to bring it to you tomorrow. If we can't, we'll look for a date, certainly in the week, where we can try and bring you part 2. And in part 2, what we're going to try and look into is fill out the rest of that United States part of the story, but then also look at Maurice Bishop in the wider context of Caribbean politics, Caribbean unity, and what his story tells us about the Caribbean then and even the Caribbean now. And before people say to me, what relevance could it have to the Caribbean now? My friends, we only just need to look at Venezuela and certain antics that have been happening in the last month and a bit, and as related to the United States. So there's plenty to learn and plenty to do. Now, as I wrap this show, people, first things first, thank you so much to Suresh. And now's the right time to tell you, if you now go back and watch the trailer for when we introduce Caribbean Cricket Network, Suresh and I will be doing a lot more of these type of episodes. It was right to introduce him with the Maurice Bishop episode because he's Grenadian. But we'd always planned in the background that we were going to start launching a Caribbean history show on the Caribbean Cricket Network. So look out for more content like this. Suresh, final words to you.
No, thank you so much for having me, Mash. Really enjoyed it. It's good for the first one. You know, looking forward to the next one. And thanks for everyone for sort of like joining the live and for any questions that you might have sent through. Put some questions in. If anything, I can have a look at the chat later on and try to address them best I can.
Love that, because Shakara Speak says Keith Mitchell was leading protests against Bishop during Bishop's visits to the US in 1983. I didn't even go there. Suresh. So for part 2, Suresh, I might have to bring that comment back up and see what you can say about that. And that's before my dad even talks about anything else that he might want to raise as well. So listen, people, I'll be Machel St. Patrick Hewitt, part of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Joined by Suresh Rao as part of the Caribbean Cricket Network. It's not always jokes, people. More time it's about actual real conversation, real talk, politics, society, culture, economics, etc. We hope you've enjoyed that. Look out for more. And if there's anybody who you know, boy, I know they don't take that London man serious, but if there's anybody who you know would actually have enjoyed this episode, please share it with them and say, actually, you know what? You need to watch this episode. They went in on a seriously important topic in Caribbean history. So do share it with any friends, family, etc. people. And we shall join you very, very soon, hopefully in the next 24 hours. But I have to see what my dad's doing for part 2. Bless up and see you all very, very soon.
West Indies Cricket, Caribbean Cricket Podcast.